Right. Today, we're moving to our post-Athenian period in the philosophers. And after Aristotle and his student Alexander, who later becomes known as Alexander the Great, his empire goes all the way to Egypt, where Alexander had himself declared a god. And that's where he lost some of the support of some of his generals, or they were just like, come on, Alexander, we're not those kind of people. But he actually had the priest of Ammon in Egypt declare that he was the son of the god. And if you're familiar with the god Ammon, he's represented by like a ram's head or horns. And there's coins where Alexander is portrayed with ram's horns coming off the side of his head, like those big curved, bighorn rams. Which, if you know anything about biblical prophecy, it's just so freaky spot on. If you remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the golden idol, but it wasn't all gold, right? It had the head of gold, which represented Babylon, the great empire, but then it had the chest and arms of silver, which represented the Medes and the Persians, and then it had loins of brass, and then it had 2 legs of iron, which represent the Eastern and Western Roman empires. And then the feet were mixed of clay and iron, and that was to represent the countries that would come after Rome. That some would be strong like iron, some would be weak like clay. But if you remember in the prophecy, hewn stone, not hewn by human hands, hits the base of that idol and brings all the empires of the world crashing down, and that stone grows until it becomes a mountain and fills the whole world. And at least from my perspective, I think that stone is Christ, and his kingdom, his empire is one that will overcome all others. But I
will love watching him do that one day. That'll be so much fun.
The reason I'm bringing that up is because of this whole Ammon thing, and we see there's another prophecy in Daniel where it talks about this one-horned ram that comes from the north and attacks the goat, which is representing the Medes and the Persian Empire. And this ram overcomes the goat, but his horn is broken, and in its place 4 grow. And if you're familiar with this period of history, when Alexander died, his empire was divided up among 4 generals. And that's how I'm reading the prophecy. I'm seeing it as an elaborate metaphor or allegory, where Alexander is representing this Grecian ram from the north, and then those that came after him would be those 4 horns, or his 4 generals that got control of different parts of his empire. This is a long historical setting, but I think it's important to understand. Alexander spread Greek language and culture throughout the world, and this is called the Hellenization of the world. The Greeks called themselves the Hellens, the Hellas, and it is out of this that we actually get Jesus Christ being born in the 1st century, came into that world really created by Alexander. And even in the New Testament, there's accounts of Hellenized Jews, and these were people that were genetically Jewish, but culturally they lived like the Greeks. They spoke Greek, they thought like the Greeks, they dressed like the Greeks, they ate like the Greeks, they were into the politics and philosophy like the Greeks. And it is in this period that Jesus came, and as you're familiar, the New Testament is written in Greek because of Alexander. That was the world culture, at least the Mediterranean world culture of the day. Alexander, though, went all the way to the subcontinent of India, in fact, past the Indus River, where he met just a completely different world full of people and ideas. And I think it profoundly changed the course of philosophy when Alexander and his men came back. And part of the changes we'll see is in the next 2 philosophies I'm going to share with you. And these are by Epicurus, who develops a philosophy called Epicureanism. And then I'm going to do another video on the Stoics and Stoicism. But these are really fun to put together because they're so opposite in a lot of ways, but they're both appearing at the same time period. And in our book, Palmer tells us Epicurus lived from 341 to 270 BC. And so if you're following this from a Christian perspective or biblical perspective, those would be like the 400 years of silence in between Ezra, Nehemiah, the Babylonian captivity, coming back into the land, and then there's no scripture for that 400-year period. But like I think I mentioned in the other class, we do have the Apocrypha. We have lots of literature being written in this time period, so we know a lot about it. It's not like it's a blackout in history. There's simply no books of the Bible being written in this period, at least that made it into the Protestant canon. If you're Roman Catholic, you've got the books about the Maccabees and other things that were taking place during this time. Epicurus is coming from the materialist tradition. In fact, he even believes that our soul or spirit is physical material. It's just made up of really fine particles. He even believes the gods are physical material. And if it makes you feel good to worship them, worship them. If praying to Zeus or Hera helps you sleep better at night, well, good for you. But we don't have to fear the gods because they're so ephemeral. Even if they wanted to hurt us or cause us harm or judge us, they don't have the power to do so. So for Epicurus, he's like, you're born, you live, you die, game over. So stop freaking out about the afterlife or what's going to happen to you. Live life now to the fullest, because this is the only life you get. And being a materialist, he believed we were just made up of particles. We live our lives, and then when we die, our particles break back down into the earth. You don't have to worry about heaven or hell, good or evil, rewards or punishments. Once you're in the grave, there is no memory, no more remembrance, no more pain, no more laughter. It's over. So live well now, because it's all you got. Epicurus developed an ethical theory called hedonism, and it is one of my personal favorites, and it's quite simple. Epicurus says, pleasure is good, pain is evil. He actually said it in the negative. The avoidance of pain is good. The avoidance of pleasure is bad. But I like it the positive. Pleasure is good, pain is evil. Now, he was very careful, though, to distinguish different types of pleasures. And first of all, he wanted to talk about natural and unnatural pleasures. Natural pleasures would be things like eating, drinking, sleeping, having comfort from the elements, those sorts of ideas. Sex would be a natural pleasure. But then he wanted to distinguish natural pleasures with artificial pleasures. And if it's artificial, like fast cars, big screen TVs, PlayStations, those things are going to cost you time and energy to secure. Then you're going to have to pay to upkeep them. You're going to have to pay to protect them. And when Epicurus says, if you weigh the amount of pleasure those artificial or unnatural pleasures give you, it's really not worth the anxiety and the effort to keep and maintain them. So he's basically saying, keep it simple, keep it natural. But then, even in the natural pleasures, he makes a distinction between natural necessary pleasures and natural unnecessary pleasures. And if you hadn't guessed it already, food, clothing, shelter, sleep, those are all necessary. Sex is not. So he's saying, even though sex is natural, it's going to cause more pain and suffering than pleasure if you do the math. You may have a few moments of pleasure, but that could result in a lifetime of responsibility or obligation, because we know how children are made now, right? So yeah, no one's denying that human sexuality is pleasurable, but he's simply saying, do the math. You have this amount of sexual pleasure, but it could lead to STDs, it could lead to having to deal with another person's issues, it could lead to pregnancy, which could lead to children, which could lead to a lifetime of obligation and responsibility. And he's simply saying, look at the cost for this amount of pleasure. And he recommends to be celibate and single because there's more pleasure in that freedom than there is in the intimacy of human sexuality. And then in the pleasures that are natural and necessary, like food, shelter, rest, we have to look at the long term of those things as well. And we need to keep it simple and in its proper place. So for food, imagine if you lived off of beans and rice. How many days a week or how many hours a week would you have to live if your diet was beans and rice? That's a question for the class. I don't know how much you guys make, but I'd have to work less than an hour a week and I could eat all the beans and rice and share with my friends and family. And beans and rice are pretty cheap. But if you start wanting prime cuts of meat and fancy sauces and fettuccine alfredos, well, it's going to cost you more. You're going to have to work more to secure those, and it's also going to cost you health-wise. I love fettuccine alfredos, but I learned a long time ago, if I don't eat a moderate small amount and I want to eat the whole pound of pasta and rich cream sauce, I'm going to pay for it. And I might wake up with acid reflux or heartburn, or I never even knew what heartburn was till I had Alfredo sauce. And yeah, the pleasure of it going down is one thing, but then do you want to wake up in the middle of the night, you know, with indigestion and heartburn? And then what's it going to do to your arteries? What's it going to do to your weight? What's it going to do to your longevity? And so he is advocating pleasure, but he's saying you have to take it in the context, like long term, because think how many short-term pleasures end up in long-term pain and suffering. And so he's not talking about immediate gratification. He's saying count the cost, think about the long-term consequences of the pleasures you enjoy. I enjoy resting and sleeping, but if you're excessive, that's what we would call a sluggard or a sloth. I like to have shelter from the elements, but as you can see, I'm not super particular about my clothes. But if I was a slave to fashion or needed brand names, I would have to work a lot more hours just so I could have that status or comfort or flash, that bling that is providing me some sort of pleasure. Or I could dress like this, and once again, for just an hour work a week, I could have a new outfit every week if I'm willing to shop at a secondhand store. But if I need to have what's latest coming out of Paris or San Francisco or New York, or the latest high-tech tennis shoe or whatever, I mean, I might have to get a second job looking at the cost of some of these things. And so long-term, not just immediate gratification. And so he's saying, keep it simple in food, in clothing, in livelihood, and that will give you time to do the most pleasurable thing of all. And this was probably going to be surprising to a lot of people, but Epicurus thought the most pleasurable thing of all was repose. And repose isn't resting because you're tired, it's simply just being. And if you keep it simple in food, drink, shelter, if you rest appropriate amount of time, work appropriate amount of time for your needs, it will leave you with so much more time if you don't have children, if you don't have a wife, if you're not running a multinational corporation. You're going to have a lot more time just to be. And in that time of just being, you can come up with great theories like hedonism. Pleasure is good, pain is evil. Most people that are in the rat race don't have time to come up with these sorts of ethical theories. And so I really love that about Epicurus. So the father of hedonism, he is a materialist, so he doesn't believe you have to worry about hell or Hades when you die. You just dissipate back into the elements from which you came, including your soul. It's just made up of little particles and just goes back into the cosmos from which it came. All right, any questions or comments on Epicurus or the Epicureans? Legend has it that he lived outside of town and just like a little lean-to. It reminds me of like in my youth, I basically had 50 feet of parachute cord. I had a tarp, and I had a sleeping bag, and that enabled me to live. And I did not have to work for rent. Right now, half of my income goes to just having a roof over my head. But before this whole COVID thing happened, I would have to be gone from my house so much of the day that I might not even get home. I'd have to leave in the morning. I get home sometimes after dark, and most of my half of my income is going to something I just get to see with my eyes closed. And it's absurd. And then if you have to have an automobile and insurance and then food and all these cares, it takes away from the simple pleasures of life. But in my youth, I was very much embracing this. Everything I had was in my backpack. I had my tarp, and I gathered my water from the creek. I got my fuel from fallen wood in the forest, and I did not have to do a lot of physical labor to provide myself with food. And I had lots of time just to be and to think and enjoy and contemplate life. Apparently, he wrecked it in the ditch of moderation, though, where when we talked about Aristotle, how you're supposed to avoid extremes, apparently Epicurus was so extreme in his simplicity that he ended up dying of malnutrition. So you don't want to overshoot the mark. You need to eat enough to stay healthy, but you don't need to overdo it. Any comments or questions so far?
I think for me as a...
Now it is interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me? My service is kind of...
Oh, we just lost him. If Carlos comes back, we'll give him a chance to talk. What's interesting to me in the book of Ecclesiastes, if you're familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, there's actually a line that says, eat, drink, and be merry. And later what happened when the Romans came in and conquered the Greeks, Epicureanism was one of the leading philosophies of the time. So after Alexander, right, we have Rome coming in and displacing the Greek Empire and absorbing it into its own. But Rome was very clever in that they didn't just supplant or destroy the cultures they conquered. Sometimes they realized the people they conquered were more sophisticated than them in some ways. And especially as far as philosophy goes, the Greeks far out excelled the Romans. And so many of them embrace this Epicurean philosophy, but it's like reformed Epicureanism, because their thinking was, well, if a little pleasure is good, a lot of pleasure must be great. So their jingle was, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And so the idea was, get what you can while you can, because life is short. YOLO. It's basically ancient YOLO mentality. Now, that is not how the verse ends in Ecclesiastes, though. And it's interesting because a lot of people thought Ecclesiastes had to be written after the 4th century BC, because it sounds so much like Epicurean philosophy. But if Solomon wrote it, we're talking 1000 BC, 600 years before Epicurus. And I think that's really interesting. But in Ecclesiastes, it says, eat, drink, and be merry, for it is the gift of God. And we are to thank God for those gifts. So it's a very different context than the Epicureanism we find in 4th century Greece. Carlos, you want to try again?
Yeah.
If you think it's going to unplug you, don't worry about it.
Can you guys hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. So back to was it who was the first philosopher who died because he was trying to live too simple?
Epicurus.
Epicurus. I think his philosophy on simplicity, for me as a college student, I think that has a lot of truth for it in itself. I don't know. For me, experiences, because as a college student, ideally you need to have the funds to go out and have fun per se. But for me, in my experiences, I didn't have that, so I would have to have fun with what I had. And by that, it was very simple. And I lived a very simple life, away from home. And I think, from a Christian perspective, when you live simple, you start to appreciate and value the little things in life, and you start to, realize that the Lord has blessed us with gifts that we, haven't even recognized before. And I think it's challenging for us now in this day and age to live that kind of simple life now, to like kind of humble yourself down to that level, and even be open to that.
Yes. Thank you. And since you brought up the whole Christian angle, John Piper actually wrote an article, I think it might be a section of one of his books, talking about Christian hedonism. And it's actually quite clever. I want to give John Piper some props for this one. So if pleasure is the highest good, it begs the next question. Well, what can provide humans with the most pleasure? And John Piper believes it's being in right relationship with God. You couldn't have a greater pleasure than that. So we could be Christian hedonists by pursuing God as the highest good or pleasure. And it's long lasting because the pleasure of God lasts for all eternity. So I think it's really clever taking this pagan, materialistic, Greek, hedonistic philosopher and kind of flipping him on his head. And the next thing you know is we're pursuing God for all eternity as the greatest possible pleasure. And Piper also has that great quote that says, God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in him, or something along those lines. And it's tying into that once again. As we find pleasure in God, God is pleased by us. And it just creates this loop of hedonism, pleasure upon pleasure, but it's high and good and pure and true pleasure. It's not the type that leads to vices or habits or poor health or death. It's the pure pleasure that comes from being in right relationship with God. And the last thing I'm going to mention before we switch to our next folks is this philosophy continued to hold power and sway, and with the one I'm going to talk about next, Stoicism, were the top two philosophies in the first century at the time of Christ and when much of the New Testament was written. And in Acts 17, we have an account of Paul visiting Athens, and he goes to Mars Hill. And Mars Hill is where people would come, different philosophers would come. And in the Acts 17, it says, and there were certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers amongst them. And that's who we're talking about today, right there in Acts 17. And remember, the Epicureans are materialists. And so it's kind of funny because Paul starts by kind of mocking the Athenian philosophers. And he says, I see that above all people, you are quite superstitious, because they had that altar to the unknown God we talked about. And so he's kind of making fun of them. But it's weird because the Epicureans and the Stoics would have seen themselves as the least superstitious. They saw the anthropomorphic gods as human constructs to control the people. They believed that you didn't have to fear Zeus or Athena or any of these anthropomorphic deities, but you simply needed to live your life and to avoid pain and suffering to the best of your ability. But Paul's calling him out on it. And if you remember, he talks about Jesus being resurrected from the dead. And at that point, it was kind of like a deal breaker. Some people said, oh, we want to hear more about this. And I think that was the Stoics. But I think at that point, the Epicureans would have been done, because once you start talking about resurrection of the dead, they just think you've gone to crazy town, because they simply believe we're physical material. We break down, our body breaks down, and that's the end of it. There is no resurrection of your body or your soul. And so I think it turned those people off. With the Reformed Epicureans, it's so much like our society today. And I'll talk about that when we talk about the Stoics. But they are trying to live for pleasure. And think about our own 21st century American culture. How many people will work all week simply so that they can play on the weekends? Or they will dedicate so much sweat of their brow so they can buy that new car, or they can have that trophy wife, or that racehorse, or that husband that's a breadwinner, or maybe your trophy husband in the society we're living in today. And so that's not that's very different from this Christian idea of where you find your peace and contentment. But that's enough for Epicurus, and I'm going to stop this one. Or any questions on Epicurus before I go to the Stoics?
Can I just make a comment?
Yes, go for it.
I just think it's so funny how a lot of people now are like, we've been through something that like we've never been through before. The gospel is more relevant to us than ever before. Like they make our situation seem like it's so unique and particular, and especially like going through these like different philosophers, it's like starting to see like this is basically just recycled, you know?
Yes. The Greeks were so profound. I really just see philosophy as all commentary after Plato and Aristotle. It's just rehashing the things the Greeks dealt with millennia ago, and they're still relevant today. So good call, Autumn. Thank you. And thank you, Epicurus, for your hedonism.